All right. As I said Thursday when we met last, today is one of the longest lectures, maybe the longest lecture you've had to endure thus far, and this is essentially out of necessity. As those of you who began the reading of Aloso and Williford for this week already over the weekend, this is chapter 3, the Americas and Columbus. You already know it's the longest chapter you've encountered thus far, and particularly when you consider that we're going to be tying in the last few paragraphs of material from last week's chapter, those on the emergence of the Atlantic slave trade involving Europeans. We have a lot to cover today, so let's just dive right in. While most survey courses on the history of the world since 1500 begin with Columbus's voyage, we've spent the first 2 weeks essentially just setting the stage for this moment. I think it's important, especially living in the moment that we are when the world is starting to shift toward a more multipolar international order, that students not have as Eurocentric or Anglo-American centric understanding of history as perhaps one could get away with in generations past. So let's just recall that at this point, China is the most technologically advanced society on Earth. It's the richest, the most populous. The Islamic Ottoman Empire is similarly vast, with large population, access to gunpowder technology, like the neighboring Safavid and Mughal empires we talked about last week, those dominating Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent respectively. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he's building on the work of a prior generation of Europeans, specifically the Spanish and Portuguese, who are desirous of maintaining access to the markets in Southeast Asia, such as the so-called Spice Islands of modern-day Indonesia, while skirting the Asian heartland for a variety of reasons we've already talked about, from plague to banditry to cost to geopolitics. A little bit of further context surrounding this initial expedition to the Americas. First, Columbus, like many, scholastically oriented people of his time, underestimated the Earth's circumference. Educated people knew the Earth was round, and they'd known this since the time of the ancient Greeks. And he did believe that by sailing westward, he could reach Asia faster than by traveling eastward around Africa. However, he miscalculated the distance, assuming that the Earth is much smaller than it actually was. And so even if you assume that the ship hadn't foundered in a storm or something, if he hadn't run across the Americas, they all would have starved to death long before they reached Asia. He also didn't realize there was a whole continent, 2 continents actually, blocking his way. And of course, it's sometime before Columbus and others realized that he had, in fact, not reached the so-called East Indies, because when Columbus and his crew sighted land in the present-day Bahamas, they believed they had actually reached the East Indies. Hence the eventual coinage of the term West Indies used to describe the Caribbean islands. Okay, so just a couple of other notes, things you may or may not already know. The voyage was sponsored by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, and their marriage had unified the 2 greatest kingdoms of the peninsula, essentially creating a unified Spain. They had then concluded the Reconquista earlier in that year. And so by sponsoring this voyage, which the rival Portuguese had already turned down, they were hoping to help expand their influence and wealth, which of course they did. In terms of absolute monarchs, you can do a lot worse than Ferdinand and Isabella, and we'll see here soon that the burgeoning Spanish Empire is going to do much worse indeed down the road. Last note on Columbus's first voyage, it was made possible by advances in navigation that we've already talked about, such as the use of improved maps and navigational instruments, things like the astrolabe and quadrant, which you can find pictures of on some of the slides, which are located on Blackboard, as always. They also had an increased understanding of things like the prevailing winds and ocean currents. In the case of the astrolabe and quadrant, these of course had been invented and refined in other places and had moved along toward Europe in places like China and in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Era. And of course, this is prior to Baghdad being sacked by the Mongols. We talked about that last week. And then they were improved continually. So it's kind of a joint project over the ages. So on August 3rd, 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, after a long and challenging journey across the Atlantic Ocean. A couple months later, October 2nd, 1492, Columbus and his crew sight land. His reports back result in the launch of a series of subsequent expeditions, as you might expect. And in part in an attempt to prevent competition among the various kingdoms of Europe, the Pope at the time, this is Pope Alexander VI, he was an Italian, he tries to mediate and successfully mediates a negotiation of this treaty between the monarchies of Spain and Portugal, essentially dividing up what they thought was the extent of the new territory, quote unquote, discovered by Columbus. This is the Treaty of Tordesillas. And basically, they draw a line right down the middle. And what they thought was the middle. And of course, they were wrong about that. And basically, everything to the east of the line was going to be Portuguese, and everything to the west of the line was going to be Spanish. It's the reason why modern day Brazil is alone really among the states of those regions who speak Portuguese to this day. Apart from variations of Spanish, which practically every other state in the Western Hemisphere south of the Rio Grande officially speaks, other less obvious colonial legacies persist. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but just as long as we're on the topic, Dutch is the official language of Suriname, which is a small Caribbean island, former Dutch possession, and English is the official language of Guyana. And some of you might have wondered why it was that the British warships were recently dispatched to the region following a series of threats made against Guyana by neighboring Venezuela, and there you have it. But I digress. Getting back to the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Pope's stock wasn't exactly at an all-time high, of course. We're just over a decade from Martin Luther nailing his theses to the cathedral door. And so none of the soon-to-be Protestant powers like England or the Dutch care much what he has to say. And besides that, none of the other soon-to-be major powers, such as staunchly Catholic France, are that interested in letting the already powerful Spanish and Portuguese monopolize what look to be extremely lucrative opportunities. This couple hundred-year period, where you're going to have the various European powers and their accomplices running around the globe looking for economic opportunities to exploit, is generally termed something along the lines of the age of exploration or the age of discovery. And it really is, at this point, just as simple as the desire for raw materials, foodstuffs, metals, labors. As Alonso and Williford point out, Europe wasn't very far removed from the Black Death and from the mini ice age, and so mass starvation and lack of labor were real fears. Later on, especially when we get into the 19th century, colonialism or imperialism is going to take on a different aspect, particularly in terms of its use as a tool of social policy. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. Worth noting for now is that wars over colonial possessions will become a regular fact of European power politics and will ultimately play a part in the outbreak of World War I. Anyway, more on these conflicts over imperial spheres of influence next week. For now, the really significant civilizational encounters are yet to come. The expeditions of Cortes and Pizarro, which are going to bring the European powers into direct contact and conflict with the most powerful states of the Americas, the Aztec and the Incan empires. And I'd like to draw your attention to this on the next slide here for those of you who are following along. Apart from some etchings of what you could expect a soldier in the early 16th century to look like, as well as a piece of artillery, which they would have taken this right off the ship and brought it with them, dragging it over land. You see a book cover opposite. It's a book that I recommend you take a look at if you're interested in this encounter. It's not a perfect book. The author is a geographer, and so he's much more interested in material factors like the positioning of rivers and plants and animal life and stuff. But Guns, Germs, and Steel, a very popular book 25 years ago or so. It's been through multiple printings. You can check it out if you're interested. The book specifically addresses the conquest and colonization of the Americas by European powers and examines the factors that contributed to the decimation of the indigenous populations, and these are fairly uncontroversial. First is the devastating impact of diseases brought by European explorers and settlers to the Americas. The lack of immunity among native populations to diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza, for example, resulted in catastrophic epidemics that ravaged indigenous communities, weakening their societies and making them more vulnerable to European conquest. Next, you have factors like technological superiority, and specifically as it applied to warfare. These are things like steel weapons and firearms. For example, if you're using a bronze sword and someone hacks at your bronze sword, if you clash with a steel sword, it's going to lop that bronze sword right in half. And as far as firearms go, they weren't militarily super useful. They took a really long time to reload, and they were smooth bore, non-rifled, not very accurate, but they were totally terrifying. They spit these, smoky, flaming tongues of flame out, and there's a lot of noise and dust, and so quite terrifying stuff. Because Aloso and Williford spend the majority of the chapter discussing the various aspects of the Aztec and Inca civilizations, I'm going to touch on them briefly here. One thing to note here, though, is that these were empires, and especially the Aztec Empire, so there were subject peoples who Cortes was able to use in kind of a divide and conquer type way to sort of facilitate unrest among these tribes who didn't want to be under the yoke of the Aztecs. So that's another element in how Cortes, with just a handful of guys, is able to take on what you're going to see here was a very complex and incredible society. So let's start with the Aztecs, a Mesoamerican civilization that flourished in central Mexico from the 14th to the 16th century. Their capital city of Tenochtitlan was located basically where present-day Mexico City is situated. And this location allowed them to establish a powerful and prosperous city. Aztec society, excuse me, was hierarchical, led by an emperor who held both political and religious power. Like other major civilizations we're going to go over, they were polytheistic. They grew crops like maize, corn, which is corn, beans. These are things that are going to come back over across the Atlantic and take real root in Europe, things like potatoes. This is the Columbian exchange that they talk about, the intermixing of germs and crops. Coffee is going to come over. Coffee can be found elsewhere, of course, but The Aztecs are growing all of these things using a sophisticated irrigation system. Society was, as I said, very hierarchical, divided into classes. There were nobilities, commoners, slaves. They had very skilled artisans and craftsmen who engaged in extensive trade throughout the region. And as with most imperial powers, the Aztecs were known for their military prowess and for their expansionist policies. And through conquest and alliance, they had expanded their empire until they exerted control over many of the surrounding areas. And they had set up basically a tribute system, which the invading Europeans, Cortez, the conquistadors, are able to exploit resistance to. In 1519, Cortez arrives, leading to a series of battles and political upheaval, and only 2 years later, Tenochtitlan falls to the Spanish, marking an end to the Aztec Empire. Now, next, moving down to South America, we have the Inca. And this was an empire located primarily in the Andean regions, those great mountains in modern-day Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, bits of Chile and Colombia. Hierarchical, centralized, with the emperor on top, followed by nobles, priests, artisan farmers, very similar. The Inca government administered the empire through a series of provinces, and they imposed a system of tribute and labor on conquered peoples. Like the Aztecs, the Inca were very sophisticated agriculturalists, particularly as they were operating at very high altitudes. They constructed an extensive network of roads, known as the Inca roads, which connected the various parts of the empire. These roads facilitated communication, trade, and the movement of people and goods across diverse landscapes, spanning thousands of miles, particularly very challenging landscapes. As I said, this is the mountains that we're talking about here. And they built temples, fortresses, and administrative centers. Like the Aztecs, the Inca Empire faces a rapid downfall due to the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. In 1532, Pizarro is going to arrive, and internal divisions and disease significantly weakened the Inca, and Pizarro captures and executes the last Inca emperor in 1533. Worth noting, the Emperor Atahualpa was captured and killed by treachery, and the cover of some of the later Guns, Germs, and Steel covers have that scene, the painting of it on the cover. Despite the rapid collapse of the Inca Empire, their legacy endures through cultural and architectural monuments. Machu Picchu, which you can still see today. There's something I'll say, that's something I'll say maybe in closing this particular section of the lecture, is that in both Central and South America, hundreds of distinct indigenous languages and dialects survive to this day. Admittedly, many of these languages have few speakers. Some in countries like Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and others. They continue to be spoken by millions of people, though. For instance, the native language of the Aztecs remains in some parts of Mexico, and Guatemalan languages such as Quiche and Cachiquel are still widely used among indigenous communities. They were, of course, targeted even by modern state builders in the 1970s and 80s. Okay, so for much of this talk, the colliding of worlds has focused primarily on the overwhelmingly negative impact that had on the societies of the Americas. Therefore, before moving on to discuss the final topic I have for us today, that of slavery, I want to highlight a few aspects of the changes this interchange between the Americas and the rest of the world had on the latter. We'll talk about this more in future lectures, specifically next time. And Aloso and Williford do a great job highlighting this topic in your reading this week. Things like the enhanced diet and metal flows that are going to flow to the rest of the world out of this region. One thing I'd like to pay special note to is that the Columbian Exchange, as it's also called, and that's how Aloso and Williford refer to it, it wasn't just the outflow of products and things like maize and potatoes, even though those were a smashing success. But bananas, coffees, and the silver. One important thing to note about the silver is that much of this silver is flowing out of Europe, and it's going to China. China had a silver-based economy, and this is where a lot of the still really advanced manufacturers were coming from. And so a lot of the silver actually winds up in China, something that Aloso and Williford go into in the chapter. Okay, so one thing that was flowing into the Americas in ever-increasing amount were slaves. Now, in starting off, I want to just get this out of the way, this completely obvious point, that slavery had always existed. No society in recorded history really up to that point had lacked slavery, from the Greeks and Romans to the Persians, Chinese, and this was a point made by later defenders of slavery in the southern United States. However, as we're going to see the transatlantic slave trade and slavery in the Americas, we're going to be systematized and commodified, marketized, and justified in a combination of ways that produce something rather unique in the history of what really is one of the world's oldest, if most deplorable and lamentable institutions. First off, if you recall from the end of the readings of last week, even though we didn't talk about it, the Portuguese had come into contact with the African slave trade by the late 15th century when they were setting about establishing their first trading posts and colonies along the African coast. As in most world societies in the 1400s, the institution of slavery was a traditional element in African kingdoms and chiefdoms. Captives were usually acquired through war or as payment of debts and enslaved for a period of time or even for life. However, generally, enslaved captives often gained positions in societies that had captured them, and their children were generally free. African traders were willing to include this human cargo in commerce with the Portuguese and other Europeans, who readily accepted them as enslaved laborers and domestic servants. The trade of enslaved people, especially from Eastern Europe, had been an important part of many societies. We talked about the Ottomans and the Janissaries, those captured Eastern European boys who were trained as an elite military corps. The thriving economies of all the Islamic empires, from Spain through Persia, also created a demand for enslaved people from Europe. The Vikings of Northern Europe, for example, sold captives from Britain to the Middle East, as did the Frankish kings of Western and Central Europe, who enslaved prisoners of war from among the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, as the Romans had before them. In fact, this is the etymological root of our word slave, Slav. Just as interesting, an etymological side note, in my opinion, is that the Czech word for forced labor, robota, is where we got the word robot from. So very interesting, I think. However, what made the African slave trade so lucrative by the 1500s and into the beginning and all the way through to the 1800s was not the demand for labor in Europe or elsewhere, but on the sugar plantations on the islands of the Atlantic and later in Brazil and in the Caribbean. The vast majority of enslaved Africans were used as forced labor in the backbreaking cultivation and processing of sugarcane. This was unattractive work to potential European migrants who were also apt to die of tropical diseases. Further, the indigenous populations had been decimated by disease, and the Catholic Church by the middle of the century had prohibited the enslavement of the Amerindians, but not of the Africans. As an aside, this was not to say the indigenous were not more often than not treated terribly and as little different than slaves. As they had been in Spain during the Reconquista, conquistadors were rewarded for military service with encomiendas. This is from the root word meaning entrusting. Encomiendas were grants of captured territory, and the people that lived on them were theoretically the responsibility of the Lord, who was then supposed to bring them into the Christian community. This technique had been used in Spain to keep track of conquered Muslims and to make sure they did not backslide after their forced conversions, the Spanish Inquisition. In Spanish America, there was a much greater emphasis on taxing and working the new peasants, of course, rather than leading them to religion. After all, even after the distant metropole passed laws theoretically granting them protections, debates that really picked up in the 1520s and gained steam in subsequent decades with the help of dedicated advocates like Bartolomé de las Casas, whom we'll see on the next slide. That authority was many thousands of miles away, and often little attempt was made to enforce it, or when it was, as in the famous or rather infamous case of the Viceroy of Peru, he was literally murdered by resistant colonial elites. Returning to actual African slavery, however, what you basically have developing over time is this interconnected complex that, for a variety of sometimes disconnected reasons, turned into a massive, horrifying, lucrative exchange. Apart from the Portuguese, who held a monopoly on transit for about a century, several African kingdoms played significant roles in the transatlantic slave trade due to their involvement in supplying enslaved individuals to European slave traders. These are the great African kingdoms such as Congo, Asante, and later Dahomey. It's crucial, therefore, to understand that the transatlantic slave trade was a complex, multifaceted, and like so many other things that occur in history, it kind of gets locked in to this kind of self-reinforcing cycle of gain and justification, even going so far as to use Christianity to argue for the continuation of the practice, something we might want to reflect on today, the weaponization of religion in the name of doing evil and the moral duty to resist. The journey from Africa to the Americas would become part of the so-called triangular trade. That is, slaves to the Americas, raw goods they produced sent to Europe, and then from Europe flowed firearms and other finished goods onto Africa, etc. This economic basis of society obviously gave rise to highly racialized politico-legal regimes. The earliest laws and legal structures that contributed to the racial stratification of societies in these regions was closely tied to Spanish and Portuguese colonial practices, including the casta system, which classified individuals based on their racial ancestry and determined their social status, rights, privileges. It categorized people into distinct racial groups based on their ancestry and how their, quote unquote, blood had been mixed. So you have distinct racial groups, which I'm going to talk about these more in subsequent lectures. But there you had the Spaniards, who were the Peninsulares, the Criollo or Creoles, those of Spanish descent who were born in the Americas. Peninsulares were Spaniards who had been born in Spain and who came there. And these would generally be taking positions like governorships, or positions with the church. And then the criollo class would be kind of your rich landowning class and your merchant class. And so, of course, they're going to come into conflict. Spoiler alert, in future lectures, that's going to be where the real tension is overruling these societies. And then you have the mestizos. These are mixed race individuals of European and indigenous ancestry. Mulattoes, so-called mulattoes, mixed race individuals of European and African ancestry. Indigenous peoples and African slaves. So if you want to look in your book, there's it's a very famous or infamous graphic that shows all the different combinations. And they had all these different names for what you were if you had one black grandparent and one mestizo grandparent, and your dad was this. It was quite bizarre and quite complex, though. They took it very seriously. And you had the laws of the Indies, which regulated social interactions, marriage, occupations, and legal rights based on one's racial category. So they actually took this very seriously, silly as it sounds. Similarly, Portugal had something like this. The Portuguese crown created the ordenações that categorized individuals based on racial lines in a similar way. You can read all about that in Willeford and in Aloso and Willeford if you like. These colonial laws entrenched racial divisions and hierarchies, with people's legal and social status determined by their racial background. And this discriminatory nature of the legal system perpetuated inequalities and established a societal framework that favored those of European descent, while marginalizing and subjugating indigenous African and mixed race populations. Fairly obvious. These early legal structures laid the foundation for centuries of racial stratification, social inequality, and racial discrimination in Central and South America, impacting various aspects of life, including access to resources, education, land ownership, and political representation. The legacy of these historical systems continues to have implications for contemporary social structures and racial dynamics in the region today. And this was, several hundred years ago, but just to give you an example, like there was a very famous study that came out several years ago that found that people in Great Britain today with Norman surnames are on average 10% wealthier than other Britons. And this was stemming from the Norman conquest of 1066. So, I mean, we're talking about 1,000 years ago now. Another interesting note, something that has been that is something that's been observed by various sociologists and stuff, like Anthony Marks, for example, is that more temperate climates hospitable to mass white settlement, racialization tended to be more strictly enforced than in tropical areas where there was a higher mortality rate and less availability of like smallhold farming. So like Massachusetts, for example, you couldn't really grow cash crops there. So there was really no point in having like large plantations full of slaves. And there were no real tropical diseases. So you could bring a wife, start a family. So it's interesting stuff. And obviously this is a 100 level course. I don't really go into this much, but there are some interesting books about that. And you can message me if you're interested. Before concluding today, I'd like to direct your attention to the next slide here, and the man I mentioned a little while ago, who's incredible because he's one of the few who vocally objected to what was going on. A really admirable guy, a man for all seasons, if you will. That's the Spanish clergyman, Bartolomé de las Casas, a tireless advocate for the rights of the indigenous. He was disgusted by his rapacious colleagues, and his own writings from the period speak to this, and this is one of his most famous. Their reason for killing and destroying such an infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold and to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time, and thus rise to a high estate disproportionate to their merits. This isn't the cheeriest note to leave you on, but that is where we're going to leave things. On Thursday, we'll have our quiz, and we'll talk about things like capitalism, mercantilism, the revolution in military affairs. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's actually next week on Tuesday. On Thursday, when I see you, we'll be talking about the growth of other European empires. Thanks so much.